basically, basically what I want to say is earlier, I believe it was Julie talked about the forest trees, I'm sorry, woods in your backyard. We also probably the Forest Service most popular publication is probably the Forest Trees of Maine, which is actually well beyond its centennial anniversary at this point. The Forest Service put out many iterations of the Forest Trees of Maine over the years. Just like the other book there, Woods in Your Backyard, the best way to get it if you're a landowner is to call your local district forester and have them come out, and you meet with them, you get a free copy. That's the best and most interesting way to get a copy of it anyway. So that's just sort of a plug right there about the Forest Trees of Maine. And most of this presentation is based off of the Forest Trees of Maine. One thing that's really useful about it is it does have it actually has two dichotomous keys in the front of it. So it has your in season, your leaf on, needle on key, and then your leaf off, dormant season, wintertime key. So you're able to identify any of the trees in the book, regardless of the season. So it's what a dichotomous key is basically it's sort of choose your adventure in terms of identifying, the plant that you're looking to figure out what it is. So there's a set of for each step in the key, there's two questions. So based on how you answer them, it leads you to another section. So that's just sort of a brief way of explaining how that works. Ideally, obviously, tree ID always is best done, in person in the field. Just a few pictures on a slide don't really do it as the justice of being able to look at the whole plant in real life. So why do people want to know what trees are? I think humans are just instinctively curious. They want to learn about what's around them, and then just from a planning or understanding point, if you do own land, you want to know what you have to work with. So understanding the composition of species on your property is really key to managing it well. And then it's just like I said, just that sort of curiosity factor that what drives our society really. So like I said, this presentation is based off our publication, Forest Trees in Maine. So the best way to get that, like I said, is contact your district forester. So the Centennial Edition has 65 native trees with 11 exotic or non-native trees. Time's not going to allow for us to cover all 60 or 70 plus trees in this time period. So we're going to kind of focus on some of the more common things and tactics to help you identify, which trees you're looking at. So of all the native trees, there's 14 species of softwood or conifers that are endemic to the state. So that we'll talk a little bit about, Julie and Alyssa talked a little bit about, the difference between hardwoods and softwoods. So, so all softwoods belong to what we call like the gymnosperms. Is two distinct groups of plants. So gymnosperms are a much more primitive clade or group of plants that are not true flowering plants, whereas like our deciduous hardwood trees, for the most part, are all members of the angiosperm group of plants, which are true flowering plants. So that's that's where that sort of difference is based off of, is the fact that there's actually two very different groups of plants that evolved independently of each other, and they're actually very different. So so here's a list of all of the conifers that are in the Forest Trees of Maine. We're not going to cover everyone exactly, but we'll touch on some of the more common ones. I went too far now. So yes, so pine. So right here, white pine is the most common pine you're going to find in Maine. It's the official tree of Maine. It's the state flower, even though technically it's not a flower, but we won't get into that. Historically has tremendous value in sort of building the state. Really, it was, you know, the King's Broad Arrow Act in the 1600s was created to, you know, preserve all the large white pine in New England, really, for the royal use of England. So it's played a huge role in the creation of our state and our region, really. So in terms of identifying it, very widespread distribution found, you know, statewide. It does, you know, preferably it likes to grow in well-drained, you know, nutrient-rich soils. So typically, like your outwash soils associated with river drainages are probably the best places you're going to find white pine growing. You know, large trees have deep furrow bark that are dark brown, where younger trees, they're very smooth. They can vary from almost a pale green to a dark brown color. So there's a pretty stark contrast between the bark of young trees as opposed to some of the older trees. Like all conifers, you can get a rough estimate of the tree's age by counting the whorls. So that's, you know, the branches are grow in whorls. So as you look up the tree, you can get an idea of how much growth has occurred in that tree in between each whorl. So white pine needles are, well, one thing about pine needles in general is they're always grow, you know, all pines, their needles grow in clusters. So the only pine that we have here in Maine that grows in, the needles grow in clusters of 5 are white pine. So if you're ever trying to identify a pine, you can see that the needles are in clusters of 5. You know right off the bat that you're working with white pine. Pretty long, distinct cones. Is in terms of all of other native pines, you know, the white pine is very large. You know, they can be, you know, 8 inches. So that's noteworthy there. So our next native pine would be the red pine. It is colloquially also known as the Norway pine, not to be confused with some of the other trees in this presentation that have Norway to begin. They are not native to Europe. They're native to North America. I believe just in the town of Norway, Maine, there historically must have been a lot of red pines. So they just called them Norways, and it's a little bit misleading, but they are native. They're typically found on dry sites, so either you know, ledgy sites with a lot of exposed rock, or really sandy, poorly well-drained sites. They have a lot of use as, you know, like sort of utility poles. Not super desirable for some of the other uses that other softwoods have, such as pulp and things. Most of the time, a lot of time when you see red pine, you know, driving down the road, it's often was planted in plantations. You'll see that driving, you know, you notice trees growing in rows. Typically, you know, native red pine growing naturally in stand is they're very widely dispersed. You know, there's not a huge density of red pine typically in native, you know, natural stand conditions. So here's your red pine cone, very different than white pine, you know, where your white pines tend to be long, very long and elongated. You know, your red pine cones are short, kind of stubby cones, very different. Okay, so one of our next conifers here is balsam fir. It's the most common conifer, you know, in terms of distribution and actual trees per acre in the state. There's a few noteworthy things that help you identify it. You know, typically when you're talking Christmas trees in Maine, you're talking balsam fir. Balsam fir is the only native fir to Maine, widely used as a Christmas tree. Couple key ways to help you identify it is, you know, when you're looking at the bark or the stem of the tree, It's a smooth gray bark. One noteworthy thing is that makes it unusual from all our other conifers that it has resin blisters. So if you look at that arrow pointing at that little bulbous sort of growth on the stem there, that's actually a resin blister that's filled with resin. If you were to like poke that with your finger or your pocket knife or whatever, that's filled with sticky resin. So it's a way of it's a defense mechanism the tree has to protect it from herbivory. The needles are somewhat nondescript. They're about 1 inch long and flat, and typically grow horizontally on the stem. That can change depending on where on the tree that the foliage is growing. So typically your foliage up in the crown is much fuller and less one-dimensional than foliage growing in the shade. One interesting thing about the cones of balsam fir is you rarely, if ever, are going to find a fully intact cone like laying on the ground in the woods like you would our other softwoods. They actually like disintegrate on the tree as they mature. So once that cone becomes mature, it actually, each scale kind of falls away in the wind and action of moving and around in the wind. And that's how it disseminates its seeds, which is unusual compared to our other conifers. So here the next conifer we're going to talk about here is eastern hemlock. So if you're going to confuse evergreen trees based purely on their foliage, like it's going to be hemlock and fir. Their needles are similar. There's a few ways to identify them when you're looking at the whole tree, but I'd say that they're most easily confused. So eastern hemlock is the only hemlock native to Maine. You're going to find it on your cool sites, typically, north facing, but they'll often found in like stream drainages or basically any sort of extreme place other trees really don't want to grow is where you're going to find hemlock. They are extremely shade tolerant. They cast a lot of shade themselves. They're one of the longest living conifers here in Maine. Probably only second to the northern white cedar. Individuals can live in excess of 500 years. The bark of mature trees is very heavily furrowed with a lot of, even on smaller trees, it's pretty noteworthy. And oftentimes, if some of these mature bark scales come off, it oftentimes has a like a purplish hue underneath, which is a little unusual. So here we're looking at hemlock foliage. As you can see, it's nondescript compared to fir. The one thing that is unusual, or what enables you to identify over fir is that is when you're looking at, if you were to strip off all of the needles off the twig, you can actually, if you look here closely, you can actually notice each needle is attached to the stem on like a little pedestal, whereas your fir below here does not have that structure. So a couple tips I always give to people when you're trying to identify trees is hemlocks have stem locks. So if you're looking at a twig and you see all these little pedestals attaching the needles to the twig, you know that's going to be a hemlock. Okay, so here we have another, a very common group of trees. We have three native spruces that you're going to find in Maine. So you have red, white, and as well as black. And then we have two common non-native. One's native to the western part of the country, which is blue spruce, and the other is native to Europe, which is the Norway spruce, which often causes confusion with people when you're talking about, red pine or Norway pine and Norway spruce, because the Norway pine is native and the Norway spruce is native to Europe. So it causes a little bit of confusion with people. They're one of the most important species in Maine. Most of those, trees, most of those 2x4s you're buying at the big box store are made from spruce. And then obviously, like it's played a huge role in the pulp and paper industry as well. So here we have red spruce here, probably the most shade tolerant of our spruces. They all tend to be shade tolerant, but I'd say red spruce is the most tolerant of shade. It becomes more dominant, especially in down East Maine and as well as the northern part of the state. High quality trees are prized for their, it's red spruce is a tone wood, so it's highly prized for making backings of things like violins and guitars, because the structural makeup on the wood actually vibrates really well, so it makes excellent material for making musical instruments. Okay, so here we have the foliage of red spruce in particular, but one thing that differentiates its foliage from some of the other softwood we talked about is it has four-sided. So if you look at it, the needle kind of straight on, it almost has like sort of a, not square, but almost a diamond sort of shape to it. And then one thing that differentiates from all the other softwoods is that the points of the needles are actually sharp. So one good tip is to, spiky spruce, friendly fir. Your fir foliage is going to be not sharp at the tip like your spruce. So in terms of form, those trees are similar. So if you're able to, get a hold of the foliage of each, if you notice the tips of the foliage is sharp, that you're looking at a spruce tree. So our native spruces have, relatively small cones. They're, typically 1.5 to 2 inches on average. So here we're looking at white spruce, very similar foliage to red spruce. One thing that helps it differentiate it from our other spruce is that it has a very distinctive smell to it when you cut it or crush the needles. So people call it cat spruce. So if you know what a litter box smells like, it's when you cut it, it's a similar sort of experience. So here's blue spruce that it's not native to Maine, but it's probably the most common or second most common planted spruce tree here in Maine. It has notably blue spruce, blue foliage to it. Very large cones relative to our native ones, but similar in appearance. And then here is Norway spruce, native to Europe. Very large cones, planted extensively, both ornamentally and for commercial plantations. One of the most noteworthy characteristic of the Norway spruce is it has very sweeping or drooping branches. So it has that kind of very distinct form to it that all of our other spruces lack. And it's got very large cones here. Okay, so here's sort of the funny tree here in the group. So tamarack or larch is native tree to Maine. It's unusual in the sense that it's a conifer, but it's deciduous. So each fall, you look in the picture, its needles turn, like a bright golden yellow and fall off just like all of our native hardwoods. Historically had a lot of commercial uses, especially in the shipbuilding industry, but contemporarily it's not a super desirable tree commercially. Doesn't really turn into pulp very well like some of our other native conifers. Its wood is typically unstable in the drying process, so you typically don't end up with straight boards after you dry it. So it's not as desirable as some of the other native conifers. It has quite a few other names to it. So tamarack or larch or hackmatack. And also some people call it juniper, which is misleading because that is referring to a whole other group of plants. So it has similar bark to spruce. So a lot of times it will get confused with spruce, but it is different. So one of the defining characteristics of identifying is larch is it the foliage grows in clusters on like little stalks on the twig, some people call them like thorns, but they're more of just secondary like woody spurs that the foliage grows from. Okay, here we have another conifer here that we have native to Maine. So our northern white cedar, or ornamentally, it's known as arborvitae. They're this, similar, they're the same species that arborvitae is just a cultivated variety of northern white cedar. It's typically a small tree. It's not going to occupy a big section of the overstory. Typically, it's very shade tolerant. You're going to find it growing in the understory, typically in areas of poor drainage. It'll oftentimes, at least historically, before high deer densities, would colonize like a wet pasture after it was abandoned, but very desirable browse for deer, especially in the wintertime. It's one of the few food sources that can actually, have a net benefit for deer to consume in the wintertime, as opposed to some of the other stuff, which is at a caloric loss to deer. So has a lot of value from a wildlife perspective for helping deer over winter. It's a great wood due to its high resistance to rot. So you'll typically find it being used in applications that require it to have, resistance to rot. So a lot of your shingles and shakes, fence posts, things of that nature utilize northern white cedar. One of the key characteristics to identifying it is it has scale-like foliage. So that's different from our broadleaf plants and our needle trees that contain needles. What's noteworthy, it's very unusual in terms of the way the foliage looks. And the bark is somewhat characteristic. It typically is long sort of strips that are brown, sometimes a reddish hue. So now we're gonna move on to our hardwood section, or deciduous trees, broadleaf trees. We have pretty high diversity. 50 plus trees in Maine would be classified as broadleaves. I do want to touch on sort of just a learning tool when it comes to hardwood trees here. So in terms of identifying hardwood trees, there's two different branching characteristics that our hardwood trees exhibit. So trees are either alternately branched or oppositely branched. So there's way more trees that branch alternately than they do oppositely. So if you find a tree that's oppositely branched, it narrows down that search for you pretty quickly. So when we're talking about opposite and alternate, I always encourage people to remember MAD, or mad dog. So by MAD, so trees, it's a learning tool. So MAD represents maple, ash, and dogwood. So all of those species are going to have opposite branching patterns, whereas everything else is going to be alternate. So here's a complete list of broadleaf trees from the forest trees in Maine. We're going to touch on some of the more common ones. So here we have maple, which are probably the most common hardwood tree here in Maine, especially this one we're going to talk about right here. Red maple is it's found statewide in every town and county. I'm sure it's a prolific tree. In terms of its successional stage or its shade tolerance, it's sort of an intermediate. It can handle high shade, but it also can do well in bright light conditions. So the bark on larger trees tend to be rough and kind of scaly, and then typically on young vigorous trees it tends to be smooth and a light gray. Has a lot of uses commercially. Typically it's not as sought after as some of the higher value hardwood trees like sugar maple, but it is often used for, some of the higher quality trees are often used for the same uses, but it also makes pallets. You can also utilize the sap for making, maple syrup. One one noteworthy thing about tapping red maple for syrup production is you typically have a shorter season to tap it, and that's only because it's one of the first trees to flower in the springtime. And once the red maple start pushing flowers, it tends to give the sap that they produce an off kind of flavor, and it's no longer usable for like commercial syrup applications at that point. It does have several colloquial names like most trees do. So its Latin name is Acer rubrum. So I like to call it, by that, red maple, but also white maple or soft maple or swamp maple are all common terms for that same tree. So most of our maples here tend to have 5 lobes, but one conspicuous thing about the red maple is the 2 lobes or the lower lobes closest to the petiole, that stem that attaches the leaf to the twig, tend to be really reduced or not conspicuous. And it tends to have a fairly aggressive serration on the leaf margin compared to, like, say, sugar maple. The great thing about red maple is that, a lot of it's red, so it makes it easy to identify. So the terminal twigs and buds tend to be a red color. Your flowers in the springtime are red. So that makes it pretty straightforward there. So here we're looking at sugar maple, also several colloquial names, sugar maple, rock maple, hard maple. So this is the one that the maple tree everybody desires to have. So you can see also has, the leaf here also has 5 lobes. But if you look at the margin here, there basically isn't serrated, whereas your red maple is very aggressively sort of serrated around the margin. So yeah, it's probably one of our higher valued species commercially. Especially veneer quality logs are some of the most highly valued forest products we have here. But it also, makes, like I said, highly valued for syrup, makes great firewood. It's lumber. If you ever been to a bowling alley, all the bowling alleys are made out of sugar maple. So here we're going to look at, the buds and twigs of sugar maple compared to red maple. As you can tell here, it's more of like a pale kind of yellowish color, or pale green, I should say. Much pointier buds. If you look at it in profile, so if you turn that 90 degrees here, it almost looks like a sort of a trident. You know what I mean? Like there's like a main point with 2 side points, whereas your red maple is much more blunt and round and red. So here, if you look at, so the space in between the actual leaf material, so each section here is called a lobe. So that space in between is called a sinus. So your sugar maple foliage typically has a much less dramatic sinus, with more U-shaped, whereas your red maple is a much harder V. Okay, here we have silver maple, which has some real dramatic lobing and sinus characteristics on the leaf, pretty distinct from the other two maples we covered. The thing about naturally occurring silver maples, you're typically only going to find that in riparian areas, so along rivers and in floodplain forests. That's typically the habitat that you're going to find silver maple growing naturally in. That being said, it's extensively planted in ornamental settings and in yards and stuff, because it grows quickly and it can handle soil compaction really well. So the bark on young trees is very similar to red maple. It's typically smooth and gray, but as a tree gets older, it typically takes on a very heavily furrowed and has long scales of loose bark. I'd say almost reminiscent of a shagbark hickory, which we're not going to talk about, but it has very shaggy bark. The twigs are similar to the other maples, but they typically have like a chestnut, kind of shiny chestnut appearance to them. Like all maples, they have a samara, a paired samara. One interesting thing, if you look at this one back here, is typically one of the two seeds that are paired together are not viable. So you'll typically find one dominant one and one kind of small, poorly developed one. Okay, here's every urban forester's nightmare situation here. Here's the Norway maple, which is not native to Maine. It is native to Europe. It's been extensively planted across North America, really, not just Maine. Unfortunately, it's considered an invasive species or an invasive tree. It's able to utilize a significant portion of our growing season. So typically the first tree you're going to find that leaves out in the spring, and it's going to be the last tree holding its leaves in the fall. So it makes it very competitive with a lot of our native trees. In terms of its foliage, very similar to sugar maple. One noteworthy thing is it typically has really long petioles, so that stem that attaches it to the twig typically are very long, but that's not always the case. And the sap that is exuded from the petiole when you break it off the twig is a milky white color. And it's actually, you don't want to like get it in your eyes. It'll cause a lot of discomfort if you do something like that. Whereas our native sugar maple, which has very similar foliage, is going to exude like a clear, basically water-looking sap if you pull that petiole off the twig. So the bark is very similar, really, I would say, to our native ash trees. Sort of, grayish brown, interlacing sort of vertical furrows. Once again, it has fruits are winged in winged samaras. So here's one maple that doesn't play by the rules really in terms of its foliage. So it has a compound leaf, which is unusual to the other maples that we're talking about. So it's much more similar to, like, say, our native ash trees. So it has multiple leaflets on one petiole. So if you look at the photo here, each section of you're looking at there is actually one leaflet. They're not considered leaves, so this whole main stem falls off the tree in the fall, just like any other petiole would. This is not retained like a twig. It's not native to Maine. It is native to other parts of southern New England, but you'll often find it growing in sort of the edge of suburbia, or especially along like poorly drained areas. It has kind of a unique twig or bud. They're typically like a chalky green or a maroon color. It's somewhat unusual in that. Once again, it does have similar bark to our ash, but it's typically a very different form. It's tend to be a lower growing, sort of a spreading tree, as opposed to most of our ash trees are more of an upright, canopy tree. So here we have striped maple. Some people call it moosewood. It's actually more of a shrub than it is a tree. Has very large leaves, 6 inches plus across. They actually really don't have much of a 5 lobes. It's more of a 3-lobe leaf. But if you do look down very much near the petiole base, you will see there's like almost a tiny little lobe trying to grow out there, but it doesn't. The bark is very noteworthy. It's like a green kind of, with white sort of in between each fissures. It's like I said, it's an understory tree. It can hang out in the shade and, hang out forever in the shade. No commercial value as a timber tree. They rarely attain a size that would have any commercial value. I will say it's highly desirable browse for our native ungulates. So deer and moose both really like to eat, especially the terminal buds of striped maple.
Hey, Jim, I was just going to let you know it's 7:26, and I know we have a lot of great material to still cover. So if you guys want to stay on the call, we're going to continue doing tree ID. We are also recording this, but if you want to stay, we are answering questions in the chat. So as Jim's presenting here, Julie and I will be answering questions. So we've had some good ones so far. Keep them coming.
Well, I'll keep talking as long as people are listening. So
thanks, Jim. And yeah, next time, guys, we won't have to take that break, so we'll be able to stay on time. But thanks for taking the time with us.
Yeah, no, we'll talk about birch trees here. I'm sure most of you are familiar with at least a couple of the birch trees here we're going to talk about. You know, I assume if you probably logged on in this meeting, you probably are aware of what a paper birch tree is. So one of the, you know, very common tree, I believe it's a state tree of New Hampshire, which, you know, which is pretty noteworthy as well. It's also known as canoe birch because, you know, historically a lot of canoes are built out of birch bark. It's one of our, you know, early successional or pioneer trees. So you're typically not going to find, you know, a paper birch seedling growing in, you know, dense shade conditions in a closed canopy forest. It does have, you know, use commercially. It's used in the tannery industry. It's used as firewood, saw logs, veneer, pulp. So it's this is a desirable tree to have. This is one tree that's oftentimes confused a lot by folks, just because it also has white bark, but it's known as the gray birch. So it's also another, you know, this is like a true pioneer species. It's very short-lived. To find a gray birch rather that's 8 inches in diameter is exceedingly rare. They typically, you know, might to attain 5-6 inches in diameter before they, you know, their life cycle is complete and they die. A lot of times that you'll find them growing in clusters or clumps. So you'll have, you know, 3 to 5 stems growing out of one stump. Rarely it attains a size that's desirable for any commercial forest products. But one good way to tell the difference between a gray birch and a paper birch is looking at the foliage. Is you look here on the left side, your gray birch has a notable point to the tip of the leaf, whereas, you know, your paper birch is much more of your kind of classic elliptically shaped leaf, and then your gray birch leaf margin where it meets the petiole is flat, almost meets the petiole at a 90-degree angle. And then so here's the bark of gray birch and white birch side by side. So here on the left, you notice the bark is tight on the gray birch, whereas you notice here on the right-hand side, the white birch or paper birch, you see all this paper bark, you know, exfoliator or peeling off the tree. You're never going to see that on a gray birch. And one thing I've noticed people tell me in the past is where the branch meets the tree, it has this notable sort of triangular, or heard of people call it a mustache. Well, you will see that on paper birch, but it's noteworthy on gray birch. Okay, here's our probably most desirable birch tree, and you'll notice down on the right, that's Jan Santerre. She's our urban community forester here. So this is yellow birch. It's probably the largest, or at least the longest lived birch native to Maine. Young trees, it's typically the bark is similar to paper birch, where it's, you know, peely and exfoliates, but it becomes platy and much more fissured as the tree grows in age. They typically inhabit cool, moist sites. So along stream drainages is sort of a classic place you're going to find yellow birch growing. Commercially, it has a lot of value. It's heavy, it's strong, it's great for making all types of woodenware, furniture, gun stocks. A lot of high quality plywood is made from yellow birch. Here we'll look at the leaves. Very, very similar to our paper birch foliage. They typically tend to be longer and larger, but that's not always the case. And as with all birch, the flowers are in catkins, so almost like a very small, cone is the way I describe it, but that's endemic of all birch trees. Okay, here's another very important group of trees we have here in Maine. So there are two unique groups of oak trees. So you'll have either your black or red oaks or your white oak group. So we have several members of each group native here in Maine. But the best way to differentiate the two is so your black oak or your red oak group is always going to have sharply tipped leaf lobes, almost terminating in like a hair-like structure. Whereas your white oaks have rounded leaf lobes with no point or leaf hair structure on the tip. Acorns with red oaks typically they always mature in 2 years, whereas the white oak group takes 1 year to mature. And then the inside of red oaks acorn shells are hairy, whereas white oaks, they don't have hair. But in terms of, on the ground, the hair on the lobe tips is always the best way to look at it, because you might not always have cones to look at, or acorns to look at. So here's red oak. It's the most widely distributed oak here in Maine. Another one of our, highly valued commercial species. And, it's right up there with sugar maple and yellow birch in terms of its commercial value. Has a wide range of uses. It's really resistant to wear, so it makes great flooring, lobster trap runners, things like that, pilings. It also has a fair amount of rot resistance, so it combines strength with rot resistance, which is a characteristic a lot of wood doesn't have. So here we're looking on the right-hand side. You notice that all the lobes are tipped with a point, almost like a hair-like structure. So that's unique to the red oak or black oak group. And here you look at the buds over here on the left-hand side. All oaks, they tend to typically cluster at the end of the twig and have sharp points to them. But here's probably the second most common oak that you're going to find here in Maine is the white oak. But you typically, it's south of Augusta is where you're going to find white oak becoming a common component to our forest. Once you get north of there, it's I don't even know if I've ever seen one north of Augusta. Anybody that has, let me know. But so what makes it unique here is so we'll look here at the foliage here. Notice that the tips of each lobe are rounded with no points. Another, all oaks have a lot of value in terms of their uses commercially. White oak, especially in the southern part of its range, is widely used in like cooperage, so making barrels. So if anybody's a big fan of like drinking like whiskey, a lot of whiskey is aged in white oak barrels. Okay, so here we're on to another group of hardwoods here. So ash, we have 3 native species of ash here in Maine, and they all have compound leaves. So if you look at where it attaches to the twig, so there are typically 5 to 9 leaflets on one petiole. So right here where it attaches to the twig, that all falls off in the fall. So this is not a woody structure. So that's somewhat unique. So here's the most commonly distributed ash tree here, native ash tree here in Maine. So it would be white ash. It's another high value tree here in Maine. The lumber is used for a lot of different purposes. So one thing it's great about ash is the wood, especially when dried, is very light but also strong. So it lends itself to making like tool handles and axe handles, baseball bats, things like that. It lends itself really well to. So here's a picture of the twigs here. Notice how we talked about earlier about opposite versus alternate branching. So ash tree here is opposite. So you can see each bud scale is actually opposite of each other. And here we look at each leaflet here on one petiole. Unfortunately, we have a non-native pest that's causing, has caused a lot of mortality to ash throughout its range in North America. And here in Maine, we're kind of the last stronghold to having healthy ash trees. So over the next 10 years or so, we're going to see how our native ash trees respond to that invasive threat of emerald ash borer. So here's green ash, similar, very similar foliage to, all ash has very similar foliage. You're typically only going to find green ash growing in riparian forest or floodplain forest. One unique thing about green ash is it has like a the undersides of the leaf has like a hairy, almost like what's the word I'm looking for? Velvety kind of feel to it, which white ash does not have. Yep, and we'll talk, these are just more twig and bud pictures. You note again the opposite branching. But here we have a sort of a unique tree here, basswood or American linden. One great thing about basswood or American linden is it's a really great site indicator. So if you're walking through your woodlot and you're identifying a lot of basswood, that tells me or any forester or anybody with knowledge of site characteristics is that you have a high quality site. You're never going to find basswood growing in a sandy, dry or nutrient poor circumstances. So if you have a lot of it, it means you have a great site to grow most hardwood trees. It typically grows in pockets and patches. You're never going to find it being a big component to our forest for the reasons I just mentioned. Somewhat unique fruits. They're Samara, but the fruit actually grows on a stalk attached to the wing, which is somewhat unusual. It's also known as America balsam wood because it has very similar characteristics. It's very light, like balsa wood, so it's great for like carving things like duck decoys and things like that. And then also it's also the honey made from basswood is highly prized. So notice it's kind of very large, sort of heart-shaped leaf with an uneven base. So when it meets the petiole, one side tends to be more pronounced than the other. The buds are alternate and very large. I've heard the terminal bud to basswood be referred to as a small heart. So if the true heart of an animal looks very similar to that. Okay, here we have one other hardwood here is beech. So another very common hardwood tree and widespread throughout the state. Very shade tolerant, so it can persist in the shade almost indefinitely. One unique thing about it is it spreads vegetatively very well. So oftentimes it'll send out underground stems that will produce new seedlings and saplings. You'll often find it growing in clumps. So a lot of times those seedlings and saplings growing around a more mature tree are genetically identical to that larger tree. So on healthy beech, you have like sort of smooth, I've called it, people have described it as, elephant skin beech. So that's how you're going to find a healthy beech free of what we call beech bark disease, which is a disease complex that affects our beech. Very hard wood. Historically, it was used to make a lot of smaller like wear items like clothespins, buttons, doorknobs, heels of shoes, things like that. It tends to be unstable in the drying process, so milling like lumber out of it tends to yield poor results, but when you keep those things small, that is not a factor. So here on the left, you see what beech should look like. So nice, smooth, free of these pock marks and injuries you see on the result on the right. And that's a result of an insect feeding on a non-native insect feeding on the tree. And then it basically inoculates that injury with actually a couple of species of fungus that causes pock mark or blistering or cankers on the tree. So what eventually happens is all these injuries coalesce and basically girdle the tree or prevent the passage of moisture and nutrients up and down the tree, and it dies, unfortunately. So when you're identifying the leaves, they're sort of a classic leaf shape, 3 to 5 inches long with coarse teeth in the margins. The buds are pretty noteworthy. They're very long, about an inch long, and long and pointy, which is unusual to any of our other native hardwoods. Okay, now we're going to get into our aspens and poplars here. Please let me know if nobody else is listening in at this point, so I'll stop if that's the case. So we really have two aspens that are really common in the state, and then a couple of others that are sort of play more bit roles here. So trembling aspen or quaking aspen is called that. Well, all aspens, their petioles are flattened, so they're not rounded like a lot of other trees. So that flattened petiole causes them to quake or shake in the wind as they catch that breeze. So that's why you'll hear, especially in the fall, the sound of a good breeze blowing through a stand of aspens is pretty, can't even talk sometimes, it's so loud. But on young trees, it tends to be smooth, grayish green. They develop best on sandy, moist soils. So here's our quaking aspen. So tend to be smaller leaves with a finely serrated margin. And then here we'll compare it to other very common poplar aspen you find in the state, which is big tooth aspen. So very similar in all other characteristics to our quaking aspen, but the leaves tend to be much larger, and in the margin of the leaf has notable teeth or serration along the margin. Typically, big tooth aspen attains a much larger size than quaking aspen, but that's not always the case. And then, so we'll talk a little bit about some of our native cherries here. So in terms of, we have a couple sort of non-commercial or shrubby trees here. So we have pin cherry as well as choke cherry. So these are like, classic pioneer species or intolerant of shade, So you're never going to find them growing in a closed canopy forest. So pin cherry or choke cherry. Choke cherry oftentimes is found growing along like fence rows and things like that, things that always have good access to light, whereas pin cherry is going to be colonize, open areas, whether that's an abandoned gravel pit, an area that had a wildfire or was heavily logged. So that's where you're going to find pin cherry. And then our one native sort of like true forest tree was black cherry. So attains a much larger size than some of our other cherry trees. In more southern parts of its range, black cherry is a very valuable timber tree. Typically here in Maine, it never really attains a size or a form that commands a lot of value as a saw log. Oftentimes it has to do with this a fungus called black knot fungus, which typically deforms a tree and prevents it from growing in a form that's desirable for commercial forest products. But that being said, it still has a tremendous amount of value, especially to wildlife. Produces crops of cherries every year that are valuable from, from everything from songbirds to black bears. Has a sort of classic elliptically shaped leaf with somewhat sort of leathery top side. And then on the bottom along the leaf, the midrib of the leaf, it has sort of rusty kind of hairs, which is a good way to help you identify it. So yeah, that concludes my my presentation on tree ID. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for presenting, Jim. You had a lot of great info there. Some things that I might steal for
is Jim taking questions now?
Yep. Do we have somebody that wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. Hey, Jim, great presentation.
Thank you.
You talked about ash trees, but would you cut your ash trees right now? What would you do? I mean, just say if you had say I have a stand in Norway, let's say about a 300-acre stand, and there's some ash trees in there. Would you go and cut those now?
So that's a great question. It really comes down to, your objectives as a landowner, and then also that sort of stands progression, where it exists in its maturity. The story of ash and emerald ash borer hasn't been written yet. There is evidence appearing some places, in the lake states where emerald ash borer has been around much longer than it has here in Maine. And they are finding there are trees that do possess, some resistance to the insect. So in the past, with some of these forest health issues, there's been a big initiative to do a lot of pre-salvaging in the face of losing all that growing stock to whatever issue. We don't know what we lost because we cut all those trees before we had a chance to understand how that forest health issue is going to interact with our tree. So that being said, if you have 300 acres of 24-inch white ash, I would be looking to to capture some of the value of some of those mature trees. But I'd also be looking to do some silviculture that's going to at least try and perpetuate ash on that site long term, because by diversifying your stand in terms of age classes and species, it's going to make it more resistant to any forest health issue. So that, unfortunately, when it comes to forestry, it's a lot of that depends. I'm sure that's probably Mike Richards' district there in Norway, and I'm sure he'd be happy to. He's a district forester as well, and I'm sure he'd be happy to meet with you on your property and give you more on-site advice about what you should do with your ash.
All right, thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.
No problem.
I'll say one more thing about ash retention too. When you guys are taking a look this summer, make note of your ash trees that actually have seeds. So it'll look really similar to the maple seeds. Those are your female ash trees. And we do need more female trees than we need males. So if you're going to retain trees, maybe tie a ribbon around the ones that are female. I'm not saying only save the female trees, but if you are going to save one that has seed would potentially be more beneficial. Do we have any more questions about tree ID for Jim, or just for any class questions in general? And we'll make sure to share that district forester map with the email that goes out to you guys with the links to both of the books that we mentioned today.
Yeah, and just while we're talking about ash, now I lost my train of thought, but yeah, I lost my train of thought. Sorry about that.
If you think of it, Jim, let me know and I'll shoot it to the email. We're going to send out a follow-up email that has URLs and information for Teams for next time. So we'll move to Teams. That should be a little bit more user-friendly, and it should allow us to continue the class without taking those breaks. Thank you guys so much for being so understanding while we've worked through this. This is at least my first time doing an all online class. Other than we do have that field trip scheduled, which we're really excited about. I've actually taken a look with Alita, and if you guys are interested in planting things in your yard and you are in the Belfast area and can make that field trip, I would strongly encourage you to participate. But otherwise, last call for questions.
Well, I remember what I was gonna say about
Oh,
ash.
good.
Like, so Alyssa already mentioned just monitoring. If you have, a significant ash component in your forest, not only identifying female trees is really important, but just generally monitoring your ash. Ash borer infestations are very insidious. The first 2+ years that the insect is there, the average person, or just looking from your kitchen window, you're not going to notice it. It's really once that population has really started to expand and it's garnered the attention of woodpeckers is when most people start to notice it. So being out there and noticing a decline in vigor, or exit holes, or a buildup of bark being chipped off by woodpeckers, foraging for the larvae in the trees, you want to get that. The sooner you can identify that infestation, the more options you have as a landowner and how to manage that.
I'll just add really quickly on the note of ash, depending on where your property is located, if you are considering doing a timber harvest, and over the next couple of years, as we get more and more confirmed counties with emerald ash borer, you may see some of the quarantines change a little bit. So that can be a good thing to look into as well. And we at the Maine Forest Service are happy to answer any questions regarding that. So that can just be a good box to check as well.
We also have some nice ash quarantine maps as well.
So we had a question here about hemlock woolly adelgid. There are some treatments that you can opt for if this is in a yard space area, but a lot of times in a forested setting that can very quickly become not so cost effective. I would strongly encourage you to reach out to your local district forester, which we will be sharing that map, URL to the map in the email. Take a look at what extent your infestation is and if it's something that could be treatable, or something where we may have to look at other options. But great question. Somebody's forester was promoted. Let's see here. Wonder if that was Terry. Greenbush, is that Terry's was that Terry's district?
Yes, that Greenbush would be Terry's district. So okay. That would be Kenny Ferguson now. I don't know if he's still on this call or not. He was earlier.
Yeah, he was just on the call.
Kenny, if you're still here, feel free to say hi.
Hey, I'm here.
There he is.
Yeah. So basically, Terry's moved on, and I've got the position. I just Abraham just sent you my phone numbers, so we'll catch up.
Thanks for being on, Kenny. That worked out great. All right, last call for questions, guys. Don't be shy. Otherwise, save them up for next time or shoot us an email. You guys have Jim's email address. If you have any tree ID questions, feel free to reach out to him. Otherwise,
yet, invite me to your property, better yet.
Yes, any of us district foresters, we love visiting people's properties, walking your woodlands with you. So please give us a call. Give Jim a call. Julie, Kenny.
I'll second that.
We'll be happy to overwhelm you with forest information.
We have so many books we can share with you. So definitely reach out to us. And we're excited to see you guys next week for our non-timber forest resources. So, we're going to be hearing about maple syrup and apple trees, which are two of our probably hottest topics when we're doing walk and talks. I think anytime there's a sugar maple or an apple tree on a property, I get questions that are going to be answered in these presentations. So thank you guys for joining us, and we'll let you get back to your Monday evening.